my name is Kimia and I'm an economist at the Reserve Bank of Australia. This video provides a brief summary of current economic conditions as published in our May statement on monetary policy. Let's start by looking at the global economy. Inflation is expected to be higher than forecast a few months ago across most economies and to be well above many central banks' inflation targets. At the same time, global economic growth is forecast to be slower than a few months ago. This graph shows the key contributions to headline inflation for the two largest advanced economies, the US and Euro area. In both economies, you can see that a large contributor to the increase in inflation has been rising energy prices, shown by the red bars. This mostly reflects the surge in oil prices resulting from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, flowing through to higher petrol prices. The war has also disrupted agricultural supply chains and seen the price of food, which is shown in yellow, and other commodities increase. At the same time, goods production in China is being disrupted by the spread of COVID-19 and associated restrictions, which will add to the existing challenges in global supply chains. These supply shocks are affecting the global economy at a time of limited spare capacity, that is, when unemployment rates are already very low in many economies. The blue bars show that core inflation, which is inflation excluding the effect of energy and food prices, which tend to be volatile, has also increased strongly, particularly in the US. This pickup in core or underlying inflation has also been seen in many other economies. This graph shows core inflation relative to its average over the decade between the global financial crisis and the pandemic. The sizable positive bars show that core inflation is well above its pre-pandemic average across a wide range of economies, with the notable exceptions of China, Japan, and some parts of Asia where activity remains depressed. Despite these low unemployment rates, wages growth has not kept pace with inflation, so real wages have declined, in some cases noticeably. This has lowered household purchasing power in a wide range of economies and contributed to declines in consumer confidence in recent months. In response to high inflation and tight labour markets, central banks in many economies have begun to withdraw the extraordinary monetary stimulus they introduced during the pandemic by increasing policy rates and announcing plans to reduce their asset holdings. Turning now to the domestic economy, the Australian economy staged a strong recovery in late 2021 following the Delta wave of COVID-19 and has remained resilient to the Omicron outbreak and the East Coast floods that occurred in early 2022. The strength in the economy has been particularly evident in the labour market, where the unemployment rate fell to 4% in early 2022, the equal lowest unemployment rate since 2008, and before that, the mid-1970s. This decline in the unemployment rate reflects strong demand for workers. Firms are hiring new staff and also increasing the hours worked by existing employees. The number of job vacancies that businesses are trying to fill, which is a useful indicator of labour demand, remains elevated and suggests we will see a further strong growth in employment. The supply of labour has also increased in response to this strong labour demand. The participation rate, which is the share of the population aged 15 and over who are employed or actively looking for work, increased to a record high of 66.4% in March, driven by strong female participation. Australia's strong economic expansion is expected to continue over the coming years, despite the slowdown in global growth, and the unemployment rate is expected to fall to around 3.5% by early next year. The Omicron outbreak at the start of 2022 and the flooding on the east coast of Australia temporarily affected economic activity. This graph shows the share of employees who worked reduced or 0 hours in a given month due to illness or natural disaster. The blue line shows the share of workers who worked fewer hours due to illness, injury, or sick leave. This increased sharply due to the Omicron wave, peaking at 8% in January this year. The red line shows that the share of employed people who worked reduced hours due to bad weather increased sharply in February. The heavy rain and floods in New South Wales and Queensland from late February onwards saw a much higher than usual number of people working reduced hours due to bad weather. Consistent with the tightening labour market, economic growth is also strong. This graph shows that the Australian economy grew by 3.4% in the December quarter. Private demand growth, shown in the yellow bars, was particularly strong as household consumption rebounded sharply following the easing of Delta-related restrictions. This increase in consumption more than offset a decline in private investment, which was affected by ongoing capacity pressures in the construction sector and supply chain issues. As was the case with labour supply, the Omicron outbreak and East Coast flooding is expected to weigh on GDP growth in the March quarter. However, the effect of these supply shocks should be limited and temporary. Consumption was the main driver of economic growth in the December quarter 2021. The top panel of this graph shows the level of consumption and the level of household disposable income across the economy. The share of income which households don't spend each quarter, known as the saving ratio, is shown in the bottom panel. The lines to the left of the vertical line are actual outcomes, and the lines to the right are forecasts. Looking first at the actual outcomes, you can see that consumption rebounded sharply as restrictions relating to the Delta outbreak were lifted. The increase in household consumption was broad-based, but was particularly pronounced for discretionary goods and services. This was the same pattern we observed in the recovery from the first set of lockdowns in 2020. Strong labour market conditions, including the pickup in the number of people working and the increase in hours worked, are supporting labour income. But overall income declined slightly in the December quarter due to the winding back of fiscal measures, such as the COVID-19 support payments. The increase in consumption alongside a slight decline in income saw the saving ratio decline at the end of 2021, but it still remains high relative to before the pandemic. Looking forward, GDP is expected to grow strongly over the rest of the year, driven by robust consumption growth as spending on services picks up. Wages growth is picking up in response to lower unemployment. The Wage Price Index, or WPI, grew by 2.3% over 2021. While this is higher than during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, wages growth is currently only around the low rates observed in the years before the pandemic. More timely information from the bank's Business Liaison Program and business surveys suggests that the growth in labour costs has picked up further over the start of 2022, and that many firms now anticipate that wages growth will increase more quickly in the period ahead. Growth in the WPI is forecast to pick up to around 3.75% by mid-2024, alongside declines in the unemployment rate. This would be the highest level of wage growth since 2012. As is the case overseas, inflation in Australia is high and increased by more than expected in the March quarter of 2022. The headline Consumer Price Index, or CPI, increased by 2% in the March quarter and 5.1% over the year. This outcome was higher than anticipated a few months ago, in part reflecting much higher fuel prices due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This graph shows the contribution to the quarterly growth in consumer prices. You can see that price increases for fuel and newly constructed dwellings, which together comprise a little under 15% of the CPI basket, accounted for close to half of the increase in headline inflation in the quarter, shown by the yellow and blue bars. Consumer durables inflation, shown in red, also increased at its fastest pace in more than 3 decades, reflecting global supply chain disruptions, sustained global and domestic demand, and high shipping costs. Grocery prices, shown in orange, also picked up strongly over recent months as supermarkets passed through higher wholesale costs. Grocery suppliers have faced higher input costs for things like fertilizers, chemicals, shipping, and packaging. Alongside high headline inflation, measures of underlying inflation were also very strong in the March quarter. This reflected broad-based price rises, with around 70% of the basket recording annualized price rises above 2.5%. Trimmed mean inflation, shown by the blue line, was 3.7% over the year and 1.4% in the quarter, the strongest quarterly outcome since the inflation targeting era began in 1993. Strong demand is enabling firms to pass through increases in input costs to consumers. These input cost pressures are likely to persist for longer than previously expected because of the invasion of Ukraine and renewed lockdowns in China. Headline and trimmed mean inflation are expected to increase further in 2022, before declining to around the top of the RBA's target band by mid-2024. Long-term inflation expectations remain consistent with the inflation target at around 2.5%. With inflation outstripping wage growth since mid-2021, real wages have declined. Cost of living pressures from rising food and fuel costs are likely to fall unevenly across households, as lower income households spend a greater proportion of their income on food and fuel and have relatively limited buffers of savings to draw upon. So, as we have seen, the economy has proven to be resilient and inflation has picked up more quickly and to a higher level than was expected. There is also evidence that wages growth is picking up. Given this, and the very low level of interest rates, the RBA board judged that now was the right time to begin withdrawing some of the extraordinary monetary support that was put in place to help the Australian economy during the pandemic. At its May meeting, the board increased the cash rate target by 0.25 percentage point to 0.35%. The board has stated that it is committed to doing what is necessary to ensure that inflation in Australia returns to target over time, which will require a further lift in interest rates over the period ahead. The timing and extent of future interest rate increases will be determined by incoming information and the evolving balance of risks. And that wraps up our summary of the May Statement of Monetary Policy. The links to the statement can be found below. Thanks for watching the update, and feel free to explore our website for more information, including some video explainers about key economic issues.